Now, June is Pride Month, and it commemorates the struggle for the rights of equal justice under the law for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and the queer community, as well as the accomplishments of the LGBTQIA+ individuals. Now, United Nations agencies, activists and some governments rightly identified particular vulnerabilities of the community that need to be taken into account, particularly in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. But levels of vulnerability vary according to factors like economic status, immigration status, and where one calls home. Now, to chat a little bit more about this, we are joined by Mawethu Nkosana, LGBTI Advocacy Lead at Civicus. It's an international NGO, and will be speaking to us about the status of LGBTI rights under lockdown in Africa. Mawethu, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here on Newsroom Africa. Let's just start off with the African Freedom Charter. As African countries of the continent, all countries have been bound to sign this, and I just want to allude to some of what it says. Paraphrasing, mind you, that the rights and freedoms recognized and guaranteed, there's respect for life and integrity of every person. Now, based on the African Charter and perhaps what it stipulates, I mean, how do the domestic legislation differ from the African Charter legislation, given the current situation within the continent?
Thank you so much for having me on. And definitely, I think that's quite a great question to start with. The African Charter, of course, is a very important mechanism for the ways in which African governments, create their own constitutions. And the ideal is that, some of the key elements of that charter is then domesticated into constitutions by member states. Of the African Charter. But the reality is that that's not the case, and especially when thinking through, the rights of LGBTI people in Africa. So sure, you've just quoted and spoke a bit around like the first generation rights, and the reality is, the right to life, is not guaranteed for LGBTI people. If you consider that there's a couple of countries in Africa where LGBTI, so if someone is identified as LGBTI, they're still subjected to the death penalty. And I think this subsequently then also speaks kind of to the right of dignity, which is also not as tolerated. So I think in summary, certain countries have made provisions for LGBTI people, and this would be particularly South Africa and maybe Cape Verde, and these are quite exceptional because at least when it comes to LGBTI regulations, they seem to compare, with counterparts in, the Americas, Oceanias, and sometimes in Europe, but the majority of Africa, the rights are still not respected. And I think even the stratification of Africa kind of gives you a sense of which components or parts of Africa are LGBT rights respected and which ones are not. And, what we find is that there's a culture perhaps within the SADC, where rights are starting, to be respected, as opposed to when you look at Western Africa, because of the context, the religion and also quite deep traditional and cultural rootings, the perception around LGBTI, people is way dire, right, than kind of the narratives that come up in a context like that.
Mawethu, I think just before we get into some of the strides taken on the continent and even some of the more extreme examples of where persecution continue to permeate in some countries on the continent, I actually just want to go back to the point of perception management. As we know in Africa, based on legal, cultural, and often religious practices, these have vastly influenced perceptions of the way LGBTQI community members have been treated to date. Looking at the policies and frameworks also that exist that also perpetuate the continued discrimination thereof. Walk us through what is unfolding on that regard, particularly in an African context, not a westernized version.
Great. Of course, one of the most, I think, difficult problems within the African context is still some sort of the understanding or like the general perception that homosexuality is not inherently African, in that it is, because of European, settlement in Africa, which I mean is an idea that research and academics have mystified like some sort of a while ago, and I think that notion or perception continues to find space in broader African communities and in broader African society, and really I think further shrinking the situation for LGBTI people. So I mean there's also I think a lot of superstitions in certain elements of Africa, which I think also like are really grounded within the perceptions on how LGBTI lives come to be. And I think the kind of rhetoric that has also been spread by political leaders, throughout, the continent by virtue of their inclination perhaps to Christianity or Islam, has also not made, the situation a bit better. So I think there's a lot of factors really that, have affected or have influenced the ways in which LGBTI people in Africa have been seen. And I mean, I think the situation is really dire because the sense of community for LGBTI people doesn't even, translate to home, because there's also been I think a lot of people who have some sort of faced discrimination from their homes, as a result. So the perception seems to be something that even also starts at home and then migrates itself into community. Of course, I think when it comes to some sort of legislation and thinking through policy, the African Commission on Human Rights, the African Commission on Human Rights, the African Commission, the Commission on Human and People's Rights. Sorry for that.
It's okay.
Recently introduced what is called Resolution 275, and the resolution is really, I think, a milestone for LGBTI advocacy in Africa because it's one of a kind, and perhaps it starts, speaking to some of the issues, that are facing, LGBTI people, and part of it being some sort of the discrimination, and of course the resolution is binding, and as a result we're hoping that we could start seeing more, court cases being litigated using that type of regulation, because I mean we've kind of seen with the Mawethu Protocol, which is kind of women's right resolution that was also adopted, the ways in which it's been effective in bettering the situation of women, in the continent, and really I think advocacy around Resolution 275 is still really building up, but I mean we're hoping that that instrument will be vital, and of course I think instrumentations like the one South Africa is currently compiling, which is the hate speech, hates crime bill, will also be vital. Because again, like the conversation at the African regional level is that by cause of the really digressive ideas that, African governments seem to have relative to queers and LGBTI people, that perhaps we also then need to invest as part of changing the perception into some sort of changing the language we use to advocate for LGBTI people. So there's been consensus on perhaps the decriminalization of homosexuality, perhaps is a very tougher language for governments who are homophobic to some sort of tackle, and perhaps what does it look like to speak through criminalizing discrimination as some sort of an entry point of starting to advance, LGBTI discrimination in Africa.
It's actually an interesting point you raise about the use of language, particularly within frameworks. I mean, if there's the recognition of minority groups, including people living with HIV, women, youth, etc., then the LGBTQIA community should also be included in that sense. But there are many who are also on the view that many African states, the heads of state rather, are employing the use of homophobia, as a means to fight and retain power. I think I want to just look at some examples of some countries in Africa that continue to discriminate against the LGBTQIA plus community. I mean, let's look at Uganda, obviously infamous for its anti-gay bill that was passed by the president, and it's also COVID-19. You know, the question remains, is COVID-19 exacerbating the treatment of, you know, the LGBTQIA community, looking at the arrests that have been made and the unfair discriminatory treatment? I mean, what's unearthed on that front? What are you observing?
I mean, thank you again for that. And indeed, you know, I think COVID-19 has particularly exacerbated, you know, the situation, you know, of LGBTI violations. And of course, if you know, consider the Uganda 19 case, which is kind of, you know, the recent case where, you know, shelter inhabitants were, you know, attacked by police and then imprisoned countless, you know, days in prison when the COVID pretext was kind of used. So, I mean, the charge was that they were violating some sort of social distancing. But in reality, you know, there wasn't any clear violation within that case of social distancing. So what we have seen is kind of, I mean, and this is almost like a similar situation with the latest case in Cameroon. We're seeing a lot of governments, of course, clamping down on the space for civil society, and in particular LGBTI groups, you know, using COVID-19, you know, regulations, some of this around, you know, assemblies, which are quite critical for the existence of movement building. You know, so the pretext on, you know, the number of people who could assemble, you know, has really, you know, affected, you know, the momentum of movement building, and in particular LGBTI movement building, you know, but also, you know, ideas of homelessness. So this notion that, you know, all LGBTI people kind of have families that they could go back to, or kind of have homes, and, you know, in creating this, you know, self-isolation, you know, pretexts, those people are left even more vulnerable. You know, there's, I think, historical issues that have some sort of been toned down by the scourge, which is around, again, you know, the long fight around fighting for access for transgender people, and in particular access to health, and the ways in which, you know, the pandemic seems to shift, you know, those long fights. I mean, there's, you know, of course, the idea that, you know, LGBTI human rights defenders are particularly being targeted within this period. You know, and the targeting is, you know, using this construct, but I mean, you know, even going an extra mile. So, I mean, of course, poverty, you know, trickles itself and affects the LGBTI, you know, people, you know, more, and, you know, that has been exacerbated, you know, during this period. So it's really, you know, I think a lot of ways in which the COVID has exacerbated the situation of LGBTI, you know, violations within Africa. And indeed, you know, it's easy for African governments to use religious rhetoric or traditional rhetoric as counter-arguments, you know, to LGBTI rights, and sometimes buy in from, you know, broader communities who still, you know, are battling with, you know, LGBTI, you know, information and the understanding of queer lives more broadly.
All right, Mawethu, thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I mean, this conversation continues. Pride Month is well into the month of June, but obviously this is a conversation that the LGBTQI community, plus community, want to see enforced on a daily basis, you know, as we strive for equality for all at large. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Mawethu Nkosana, LGBTI Advocacy lead at Civicus, just speaking to us about Pride Month and the rights of the LGBTI community in Africa, particularly under lockdown.